first thing that I want to talk about is the selection tool. There's a lot of tools inside the selection tool, but selecting things is critical to almost everything that you're going to do in Mesh Mixer. So understanding it is important. So I've got this rabbit up here, and I just clicked on this the sculpting tool, the keyboard shortcut. That is S. And so if you're just doing something else and you want this tool, just type S on the keyboard, you get the same thing. If you notice on here, there's two different ways that you can select things. One is to use a brush. This is me using the brush, okay? When you have the brush selected, there are other ways to select. One of them is to click out here away from your model. And to click one time, like click and release. And what that does is it starts a polygon selection tool. And so I can come through, circle the rabbit's head, and it selects the rabbit's head. Okay. And let's say the area here on the back, let's say I don't want all of that selected. If you hold down Shift, you can deselect areas that previously were selected. Just like this, okay? Also notice that let me start that over, when you're painting, it doesn't go all the way through to the other side, okay? But if you do this one here, it does. And sometimes you can use that in your favor. Sometimes you actually want to select straight through. Another one is still clicking out here, but instead of clicking and then letting go, you just draw, okay? Notice that right here, as I draw, it will select one half or the other. And normally, my understanding is that it selects the smaller side. So you come like this, and because this has fewer triangles, you're getting that side being the one that's selected. You can always invert that selection, which I'll talk about in a little bit. It gets really crazy if you start doing kind of all over the place. See what I mean? It just kind of selects gobs of different things. So I don't know how to manage doing it that way, but I don't know why you ever would. The other thing that you can do, though, is what they call a lasso. And see how right now I'm coming along and tracing a selection. So for example, if you ever wanted to go and select a margin, you could do it this way and see how that selects just that area. Unfortunately, like DentalCAD software, when you're working with margins, it doesn't give me the ability to go in and edit that. I'm going to go ahead and just start that over. All right, so now I want to talk about these things over here. Okay, you've got different brush modes. I don't play around a lot with these. My understanding is that I've always had best success working with an unwrapped brush. My understanding with that, it means my brush is a flat brush, and the only other one I've switched to is the sphere brush. And if you look, you can see that my brush is now a sphere, and I believe if you go to a really thin area, it will select all the way through because it's acting like a sphere now instead of a flat brush. And so I've used that when if I scan two sides of a denture and they're overlaid perfectly, but there's overlapping parts, I've used this brush to go and make a selection all the way around that selects, well, I combine them first. I combine those two STLs, and then I go around the edges with a sphere brush because that ensures that I'm selecting all of the triangles along the way. Then I delete those, and then I can take the intaglio and the cameo surface as separate STLs and then kind of bridge them together and close things up. So that's the only time I really worry about that. If you want to know about like the symmetry thing here, that specifically is if you look at, there's this line right here, the symmetry line, and you can edit that line. Honestly, I never have found a use for this, but see how like it's mirroring my selection. So it's there, but I don't ever mess around with that. These filters, these become quite useful, okay? This expand mode, let me start that over. So every time I hit S, it deselects everything and has the tool selected. But the expand modes right here, I've never played around with this vertex color similarity, but these other two I've used quite a bit. This one not as much, but if you look right here, it says right click drag. So if you hold down Control, at least on a PC, if you hold down Control and you hold down the right button on your mouse and start moving upward, notice what it's doing is it's expanding by a geodesic distance. Really what it does, it just expands it out further and further and further. That one's nice, but the one I really like is this crease angle one. Because if I want to select just a flat surface, earlier I closed the bottom of this bunny to show you a couple things. But if I select this area here and I hold down Control and move up, notice how quickly I can just like that, I can select a flat area. I use this all the time. All the time. It makes it so much easier to select things. If I'm not doing it that way, instead I'm using this option right here, this crease angle threshold. Essentially what this is saying is that if I'm using the brush, and I'm going to make this bigger. Oh, and to make the brush bigger, you can do a variety of things. You can play around with this right here, but notice that it's not very helpful because I can't see where my brush is on my model. But if I'm holding it here, the keys that are just to the right of the P as in Paul, key on your keyboard, the one bracket makes it smaller, the other bracket makes it larger. Much easier to manage. But if I have this down here and I select this area here, see how it selects everything? But that angle right there, it's a pretty sharp angle. It's almost a 90-degree angle. If I instead drag this crease angle threshold up and I do it again, notice how it doesn't cross that. And I can come along, I don't even have to be that careful, and see how I can just select all of that. And notice what happens if you're on a very curved surface. It really is only selecting that one in the middle because everything else is just enough of a curve. And if you start changing that, you can kind of find, you know, where is the point. See, like right there at 73, that angle is just extreme enough. So I use it all the time, mostly when I'm selecting flat areas that I want to do something with. So I'm going to go ahead and start over. So that's these tools right here. Once you actually select something, you'll notice that all of these stay. Let me change that again. So you got select and filter, but once you select something, now you still have your select and your filter. They haven't changed, but now you get these options at the top. And there's a lot of magic in these tools. There's so many things that you can do. The one under edit here, there's tons of options here that it's like a rabbit hole of options. We're going to come to that later because I can more quickly tell you about all the other options in this video, and then we can get back to these and maybe even do individual videos for these. So we'll go kind of easiest to hardest. The convert to, I showed you in the previous video how you can use this to make your own custom library over here in the mesh mix section, my parts. So right here, this is how you can make a part and then put it there. And throughout the course, I'll add a couple more there for you. But for now, just know that that's where that came from. Okay, so let's go back to the select tool. And so other than that, I don't do a lot with these. Obviously, you could, make something into a stamp, a solid part, an open part. Deform is, depending on how you look at it, is super useful and something I hardly ever use all at the same time. So some of these tools are great. Some of them aren't. The smooth tool right here. So if I select an area, I'm going to drag that back down. If I select an area like this, or if I select the entire thing and I go into the smooth option, notice what it does. It just takes all of that and just smooths it over. And there's a lot of things you can play around with in this option. I don't play around a lot with these. Max smoothness, you'll see this causes problems. Hold on. Let's do this again. All right, we're back up and working. Rather than selecting the whole entire bunny, when I show you that one, I'll just do a part of it. So max smoothness, you can see it really smooths it out. That's like taking wax and hitting it with a lot of fire all at once and just smooths it out. So there's a lot of different things you can play with. Okay, you can see play around with smoothing and the scale and the constraint rings. I'm not going to get too much into that because it's not something that I do very often. Another one is either the transform or the soft transform. When it acts a little different than the transform that you see right here, because when you have something selected, and we'll do it this way, we'll grab this rabbit's head again. All right, so we've got this rabbit head. All right, all selected. When we come in and we do a transform, what that does when you have an object selected is it allows you to kind of pull away from something like so. Okay, so I can hit accept, and now we've got, you know, a rabbit with a really long neck. Okay, notice though how that came just straight up. I always say it's that a transform used in this way is like a building that just comes straight up out of the ground. I'm going to hit undo on my keyboard. That's Control Z, hit cancel. And I'm going to show you the difference between that and a soft transform. In a soft transform, notice that I had just the head selected, but now it has more triangles selected. And if you look over here, this fall off is controlling that. I can drag this up and down. And what that is telling you is any of those triangles beyond your original selection, the fall off, that is, think of that as flexible, like rubber. And so you come in, and now if I grab this, see how it's taking these triangles that are in between, and see how it's like stretching those triangles out. Okay, so now you get a much smoother transition. So it really depends on what you're going for, what you want it to do, and why you're doing that transformation. Okay, let's go ahead and do a little undoing again. Undo. All right, so that's the difference between the two, and I really don't use that a lot, but at times I do need it. Okay, I need that to have that smoother transition. And then the last one is warping. Okay, warping is an interesting one. Warping is kind of a way to take an entire object and just kind of nudge it in different directions. So for example, let's say, and notice when you open the warping tool, there's not much here. Okay, it just says accept, cancel. The tools for it is to double click with your left mouse button to double click on the surface, and what you're doing is you're creating these points. And think of these points as kind of points that restrict the movement. Okay, and so for example, I've created a bunch of points, and now instead of double clicking, I just click and hold that same left click, and see how I can pull on these a little bit, and I can stretch this in different directions. So see how it's you know, we're kind of making our bunny look a little bit more like a T-Rex here. But notice that anything back behind where you have it is going to be greatly affected. If I grab this, see how it's stretching the entire ear, whereas if I put another one there, see how it kind of changes how that is deforming, or warping, I should say. Let's see that. So that's interesting. If you have like a tooth that you want to just kind of nudge in different directions, you could add a bunch of points and start doing some warping. So that's that. Okay, then so we've covered the convert to and the deform. Then we've got the modify. Modify, I never do it from here. I always do the shortcut Control A, but obviously if you want to select an entire object, that's what that's doing. Select visible. Let's see. Go back. Select select visible. So see how that only selected what was showing. And so for example, if I come down like this and I come through and I click on one spot, but then I say select visible, notice how now it's selected everything. So if I were to invert that, these are all, we'll say these are the undercuts. So if you ever want to kind of select an undercut area, that's a way you could do that. You see the undercuts and they come straight down through because that was, so technically I guess this isn't an undercut right here. You could, you know, but that's what that does. Expand ring is similar to what that geodesic distance was doing. So if you look right here and you say expand ring, and notice the shortcut for this is the greater than, and then contracting ring is the less than, because if you click on this, then it does it, but then you'd have to keep going. So in that one, I would hold down shift and then go bigger, smaller. And I've used that at times to change a selection, to kind of grow that selection larger or smaller. These two right here are very, very useful, okay? And I want you to notice the shortcuts for them is E for expand to everything, and G to expand to groups. All right, and so if I click on an object and I type E, it's going to expand to everything that's connected. When it says connected, specifically what we're talking about, and I'm going to drop down, is if I have one triangle selected, and then I tell it that I want to expand my selection to everything connected, what it means is that it's going to go out further and further and further, kind of like this whole thing, until it goes and covers the entire object. Okay, now it's, you know, everything is selected, but it just, you know, obviously does it a lot faster. The expand to groups, if you were to just have a bunny like this and you hit groups, it's going to look like it did the exact same thing. The difference is that this bunny doesn't have any different groups. And groups are a very useful way, and we'll talk about those in just a second. In fact, maybe we'll talk about them now. Okay, so let's say you've selected an area like this. Okay, and let's back up. Let's go back to the head option where we're selecting this bunny's head all the way over. So we've got the bunny's head selected, and what we can do here is what this is called a create a face group. Okay, it changes the color. If you noticed, you know, when we did the transform tool, the keyboard shortcut for that is T, but notice when we did that, it created a different color. So some tools, when it runs them, it creates these things called face groups. Let me undo that just a little bit, cancel. All right, so face groups are, just think of a face group as putting an identifier on a triangle that groups it with a group of other triangles. So for example, you zoom in real close right here. All right, so you've got these triangles that are in this kind of purplish pink color, and you've got these that are in the gray, okay? If you click on one of them that's within a face group and you hit G, now it's expanding to just the group. The whole entire group was selected, okay? So that's useful. The other thing to know is that if you ever double click on an object, it by default is the expand a group tool. And so if you double click on here, see how it's just selecting one color. Very useful, and it helps to speed up on some things. If you have, for example, if I'm doing an extraction of a tooth digitally, I just go around the entire tooth and carefully select what parts of the tooth I want to be deleted, and then I can make that into a group, and then I can just double click everything on the inside, and then everything gets selected. The whole tooth gets selected, and it's useful, especially if you've got a full arch of teeth that you're digitally extracting. All right, going back into here. So we've got create a group is what we just did, but also clearing a face group. So say you've got a whole lot of parts of this bunny that you have as different face groups, or you've been working on a complex project and you have created, just through using different tools, there's just all these different colors and you're ready to be done with it. You don't need those colors anymore. Does it matter if you export it? No, it doesn't. But you can just delete all those. Okay, it basically just takes those triangles that used to have an identifier on them, erases it. Okay. All right, going back, let's finish this. Smooth boundary is a very, very nice tool, and I use it all the time, mostly because what you'll learn about me throughout this course is I've got a lot of OCDs with meshes and trying to make things look nice and pretty. But if you look at this, that selection is kind of jagged. If I were to delete that right now, it leaves a very jagged edge. If you want to smooth off your boundaries, you can use this tool called Smooth Boundary. The keyboard shortcut for that is B. But see what it did is it came through and it affected a bunch of different triangles in here, and it made a very nice smooth. And you can play around with these. The smoothness is, you can see it's trying to make it even more of a smooth line instead of like a jagged line. Preserving the shape, if you need the shape preserved, notice that as we did the smoothness, it started coming inward. Okay, see, that might even show a little bit better in the beginning. See how it's starting to come more and more smooth, but then it starts to come inward, so the shape of the bunny might be changing. And so you can do this to preserve that shape, crank it to the side. But if you don't care about the shape, you just want it as smooth as possible, you can drag that all the way down. Iterations, there's a lot of tools that have iterations. My understanding of an iteration is that these tools, they kind of like do something, and then they do it again, and they do it again. It's like, when I say something, I mean like running some math, like an algorithm, where it looks at everything and it goes, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. And then it knows that it can't do it all in one go, so then it repeats it and repeats it and repeats it. And so changing the iterations just kind of magnifies the effect that you're after. And so you can see that it just keeps doing it over and over. So depending on what you're doing, it would make sense. Like if I have like an edge to, if I just trimmed up a model and I want it the smoothest possible edge going around, what I'll do is I'll crank smoothness up to 100, preserve shape down, because it's not really going to change the shape of the outer edge of an object, but it will mess around with those triangles to get them smooth, and then the iterations. And so let me back some of this up. So the iterations we can take back. So now notice that from before where we had a very jagged edge, now we have a smooth edge, and it's done that by taking the triangles and taking like the bases of the triangles and putting them together so that we have a nice smooth edge. And if you were to delete this, then you've got that nice smooth edge. Or if you were to do like a transform operation, if you remember before, we had these very jagged one, and when we did the transform, it created these jagged edges. And so, for example, if you're doing things like an extrude function, which we'll do later in the course, an extrude function that is used to add a base to a model, and you want the sides of your model to be smooth, make sure your boundary is smooth. And then when you extrude it, everything is going to be smooth on the edges, not like this right here. So we'll go ahead and Control Z, undo some of that stuff. Okay. So then, let's see what we got left. Optimize boundary. So optimize boundary, let me go back to the smooth boundary tool. So one thing about the smooth boundary tool is let's go like we're going to select this rabbit's head and do a smooth boundary. Okay, and I'm intentionally getting kind of sloppy with this. Normally, if I really was doing this for real, I would make my selection brush a little bit larger. But I wanted to point out some things to you. See these areas where we have these triangles that are kind of like unselected islands in the middle, like this? That doesn't fare well for the smooth boundary tool. Notice when I run the tool, it's struggling quite a bit. Okay, so I'm going to hit cancel, and either I can go in like this and I can clean those up, or they have that option to optimize the boundary. Now, depending on how much you had selected, it might undo some of what you're wanting to do. Let's see here. So let's say that I had a little better selection. I've never kind of been as haphazard as I was just then. But notice that in areas like this, I'm going to make my own just in a few areas where we've got some issues, okay? So if we try to do this, the smooth boundary, the B as in boy, notice it's saying it's unhappy, okay? But if we hit cancel and hit O first for optimized boundary, then we run that, now we've got this nice smooth boundary. Okay, so that's what the optimized boundary is talking about. And then invert is exactly what you would expect it to be. I've got one thing selected, but I want to change it so that the other triangles are selected and this one is not. So if I come through here and I do invert, now everything else is selected except my selection. And so a lot of, think of all these tools as ways that you can manipulate triangles, okay? Like we discussed before, digital dentistry comes down to triangles. And you have to think of these objects. You don't have to have the wireframes on, but you have to think of these objects. You know, this isn't a bunny. It is a bunch of triangles that look like a bunny. They're just shaped to. And if I want that bunny's ear to be longer, I need to either stretch or add triangles to make it that way. And the more you can think of it as triangles, 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 the better you're going to understand the different tools that are out there. So that's what the invert is it changes, you know, it flops what you have selected to what you didn't have selected. The last one that is on there, I'm just going to remove those. The last one that's on there is the invert to connected. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. And for that, I have earlier, I added this sphere, and I'm going to combine these two into one. Okay, so if you think about these triangles, I like having those on when I'm talking about triangles, but if you think about these triangles, even though the software has taken these two STL files and it's combined them, okay, I always, in the courses I was teaching, I always explain combine as a post-it note, a sticky note. Okay, just like you can take that sticky note and you can stick it on the wall and it's there, it stays. But then if you need to take it off, you just take it off. That's what I've always said about combine, is all it's doing is taking two STL files and sticking them together. They're not permanently together, and they're actually, depending on what you're trying to do, those are actually not even connected together. They're just like held there together. Like Legos would be another way to think about it. You can take two pieces of Legos, put them together, and then it's like they're one, but you can always just take them back apart. And so if you think about it, like if you zoomed in right here, this triangle right here is not connected at all to these ones here that are gray. If we were to expand it, notice how it only expands across those that it's connected to. Or if I were to hit E, it's only going to select those. Whereas if I click on one of these and hit E, it only selects those. They are not connected, but they're combined. And so if I was over here on the bunny and I selected something right here and I just do a regular invert, notice that it inverts my triangles to the whole combined STLs. But if instead I do invert connected, notice the difference. It didn't include the sphere because the sphere is not connected. So it's doing an inversion of what was selected, but it's doing it just to the object that is connected to these. So that's the difference there. So we're going to spend a whole different course looking at these other options under the select, because they're more complex. Okay, and I'll put those in a completely different video and we'll talk more about those. But I hope that understanding at least what we've talked about today gives you an idea on how to manipulate these triangles, because in the end, that's all you're doing, is you're just moving triangles around.